Great. So, on that basis, the agenda for this morning is that I'm going to give some very brief introductory remarks, and as I say, we're then going to move to a series of short contributions from some of our Academy members. So if I just share my screen, I did pull together just a few slides. So if somebody could just wave or give me a thumbs up to make sure that you can see these, that would be greatly appreciated. Fabulous. So I'm going to just set the scene with a couple of words, as I say, to talk a bit about what we mean by this concept of just transitions, and specifically this means for coastal regions and for coastal societies. So the idea of a just transition is something that you might have come across. It's getting a lot of interest in international policy rhetoric and international scholarship. It's mentioned in some of the outcomes from the Paris Agreement and from some of the work of the UNFCCC. But what is a just transition? So in kind of a broad sense, a lot of it's accepting that, we have a need globally to move to a low carbon or a zero carbon and indeed sustainable economy, one that moves away from a reliance on industries that are maybe harmful to the climate or the environment. But also it's realizing too that there's a lot of people globally who rely on things that might not be sustainable for work. You've maybe got regional, local, even national governments that rely on income from things that are not necessarily good for the environment, things like oil and gas production, petrochemicals, steel making, all these kind of things that are very, very harmful. And so a just transition is sort of recognizing that we need to develop realistic and feasible pathways to a sustainable and low carbon economy, both locally and globally, that recognizes that there are people and places who maybe rely on things that are harmful, and also ensuring that we don't create new inequalities or injustices along the way. And let me just explain a little bit about what I mean by that in a little bit more depth. So, the just transitions as a concept has got a pretty long history of a few decades. And initially, a lot of this thinking emerged in labor unions and labor studies, especially when it came to thinking about what environmental policy and responses meant for workforces that were involved in things like oil and gas. And that was especially in Australia and Canada, places where you maybe have a very big extractive industry sector. And when you talk about closing these industries down for the sake of the environment or for the sake of renewing our energy systems, you're going to have people who are a bit worried about, well, what does this mean for their jobs? What does this mean for the local or regional economy? And so, the idea of a just transition is ensuring that you don't leave these people behind in the process. But, and we're going to see this today with the contributions that we have, the idea of what a just transition is, the concept has broadened out quite a lot since then, from that kind of very early and narrow focus on labor and jobs in extractive industries. So there's been more interest in scholarship in recent years in some of the places that rely on resource industries. And so what does that mean for places that rely on things that are harmful to the climate? What does that mean for the effect for consumers, for the public, on how we change our energy systems and our resource systems? What does that mean for the places that we live in? What does that mean for the local economy? And so essentially, the idea of just transitions has gone beyond this narrow focus on oil and gas workers to think about, who might be the winners and losers in society more widely as we respond to a breadth of climate change and sustainability imperatives. And there's a lot of interest as well in, well, what does a just transition mean outside of Western or global North context? It's no secret that a lot of that research to date has focused, as I say, on North America, Europe, Australasia. What does a just transition mean outside of the global North? Particularly, what does it mean when we kind of get away from oil and gas and then coal mining and steel working and all the rest, and think about, well, what does this mean for parts of the world that might be, through no fault of their own, asked to take up infrastructure or certain strategies and schemes to offset and soak up the emissions of others. So what is specific then about coasts? So what are some of the specific challenges that coasts have? And you can see here in the background, this is why this is a topic that's quite close to my own heart. This is the Cromarty Firth. This is just north of where I was born and where I grew up. And as you can see, we've got a lot of oil drilling platforms that are in the sea here. So I live in an area where a lot of people's lives, a lot of people's work has really depended on building drilling rigs for the oil industry. And now as we shut that down in the North Sea, that has effects on the local economy and jobs. And also, coastal societies have got a lot of potential as sites for climate change mitigation. Offshore wind is going to be a huge thing. Blue carbon, storing CO2 in marine ecosystems and seaweeds and seagrasses. There's a lot of potential there for coasts to help meet some of the challenges that we're facing when it comes to climate change. But it's also true that, particularly because of ports, connectivity, coastal societies can rely quite heavily on natural resources and on on things that produce emissions for jobs and economies. Power generation being one, shipping being another, petrochemicals, refineries, all these things. You tend to find these largely but not exclusively in coastal areas. So as we talk about changing our energy systems, what's that going to mean for these coastal societies where their economies rely on natural resources? And also, it's absolutely vital that these developments happen in the interests of the communities that are nearest to them. So if we're putting in wind farms or whatever, if we're asking communities to preserve a kelp bed or whatever to soak up carbon dioxide, it's absolutely vital that the communities that we're asking to do this actually get some kind of benefit, whether that's in terms of jobs, innovation, quality of life, or whatever. That's absolutely vital. So just to give you, again, a very, very brief example of what I actually mean by this. Again, this is from my from where I grew up and near where I live now. So Scotland, North and West Scotland, we've actually got a lot of potential for offshore wind, and we can produce an awful lot of wind energy in Scotland. We're very, very good at making electricity from wind. But the question is now being asked of, is this actually benefiting some of our rural communities in Scotland? Is it actually benefiting the people that maybe used to work in the oil and gas sector, who are maybe now looking for other jobs? Some of the questions then, so as I say, we're very good at producing wind-powered electricity in Scotland. What we're not so good at is distributing some of the benefits of that fairly. So our rural communities have some of the highest electricity prices in the UK. People are looking out their windows, they're seeing training do we need? How do we make this work for the people that we're asking to take these interventions up? So just to kind of zoom out globally and just set up our four speakers this morning. So there's a range of challenges that we see in different settings. One is what I've just spoken about, and that's the kind of closure of high emitting industries which accumulate in coastal regions, and what that means for people's jobs and their livelihoods. There's also the question of things like offshore renewables, and what are the benefits for the communities that have to take up infrastructure to meet national targets. So, where I live, we have a lot of wind farms. That electricity is being sent to the big cities. What's in it for us? Is that fair for us? There's also questions of how we remediate and how we rehabilitate coastal ecosystems that might have been polluted by past industrial activity in complex ways. So arguably, part of a just transition is not just looking forwards, but it's also looking back and understanding how to rehabilitate and redress things that have gone wrong in the past. And lastly, there's also this bigger question of resource-intensive economies, or kind of resource-dependent agriculture dependent economies, especially in the global south and especially in less wealthy nations, where you see a lot of this rhetoric now around nature-based solutions, around blue carbon. What does this mean for communities that are being asked to soak up these emissions, that are being asked to make changes to their livelihoods for the benefit of others, despite having contributed very little to some of the climate change and sustainability issues that we're seeing today? What does a just transition mean on a global scale? So these are just some kind of open questions, and I wanted to just stick these out there to kind of set the discussion this morning up. So at this point, I will simply stop. How it's going to work is we'll have 4 short contributions. What I propose is that we've got time for discussions at the end. So in the interest of keeping things moving forwards, we'll take just very short technical questions after each session. If somebody has something that they don't understand or want to clarify, then either put that in the chat, raise your hand. But if you have bigger, broader questions, let's save those for the end for the discussion time that we have. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing there. Thank you for your attention to this short introduction. And I think our first speaker that we have coming up is Tim Smith. So Tim, I think Tim, who's a FEC Academy member. I keep wanting to say FEC academician, but that's a very hard word for me to say because our English isn't very. So Tim is one of our FEC Academy members who is going to kick us off with a short contribution on what a just transition is.
Oh, thanks very much, Leslie. And look, I think as an Australian, my English is probably much worse than yours. But thanks very much, Leslie, Liana, and also to show you and Huzi, I think, for these sessions. I think they're fantastic sessions. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I am. The Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also want to pay my respects to the 4 people that lose their lives every week defending the environment. I know these talks are quite short. There's 10 minutes, so I'll be as brief as possible. And I also want to acknowledge that this is part of a larger initiative that I'm working on. So Dr. Carmen Elric-Barr, that's a FEC Fellow and in the audience, Associate Professor Dana Thompson. There are 4 PhD students, and we also have national and international collaborators, and happy to provide more information on some of the things I talk about later. But I realise that I've just got a few minutes to talk, so I wanted to pose this question: what is just transition? And we've heard from Leslie about some of the challenges that we face, but I wanted to go back to some of the basic principles. So a lot of people, and I think this is the view of sustainability that a lot of the just transition discourses focused on, and I don't believe that it's really looking at the interactions between society, environment and economy in a truly realistic way. Now, this is a very weak view of sustainability, and I think it's dominating the just transition discourse. Whereas, as we know, there's a hierarchical relationship between environment, society, and economy. So without environment, we have no society, and without society, we have no economy. But none of this is reflected in any of the just transition discourses that we face. So I think that these discussions of just transitions are really dominated by an anthropocentric worldview. Carmen and I have done quite a bit of work looking at policies and laws around Australian coastal management, and certainly the anthropocentric worldview dominates all of those policies and institutional arrangements. So what we find is that people, well, some people and some property are privileged over the more than human in our just transition discourses. So a picture here of the Gold Coast in Australia. And obviously, we don't talk about the flora and fauna that how they're going to transition in a just way. And I think this is a critical issue that we're missing out on. And I think the IPCC and the Conference of the Party discussions have moved further and further away from the more than human dimensions of just transition discourses. So, and I think we've really regressed from, say, you know, the 1992 Agenda 21 Rio discussions. I think we're actually moving backwards away from talking about justice for the more than human. So I just wanted to start that as a provocation, I suppose. The rest of my talk is going to be focused on just transitions for communities, for people. But I just wanted to start with that because I think it's a very important aspect that we're missing in the just transitions discussion. Now, if I move to Australia, we can say that Australia's economy perhaps has benefited from natural resources, and I'll put a question mark there because I think some people have definitely benefited. You know, the richest people in Australia are the mining magnates, Gina Rinehart, for instance, Clive Palmer. But I think there are a lot of communities, a lot of economies that have been decimated by the impacts of climate change. We've seen the impacts of flooding and bushfires in Australia, communities that don't gain benefits from extractive resources. But coal, Australia is the second largest exporter after Indonesia, fifth largest producer, and has the third largest reserves of coal. So coal, iron ore, other minerals are certainly a dominant feature of the Australian landscape. But there's been a lot of, obviously, protests, particularly among the youth in Australia. And there was a huge change in public voting patterns in the last federal election, where we had these independents called the Teals, who really dominated a lot of the electorates. And they were standing on a pro-climate action stand. So, you know, there's a lot of disparity within Australia around the benefits of mining, extractive industries, and particularly coal to the Australian economy. I would actually say that it's actually immigration that is probably more of a dominant force in terms of making Australia a wealthy nation. But we can discuss some of those things later. I also wanted to make the point that Australia is actually quite different to a lot of other parts of the world because most of the mining communities in Australia aren't on the coast. They're inland. So we have port communities that are dependent on some of the mining industries, but apart from gas, most of the mining is inland, in our deserts, in our very arid regions in Australia. So the coastal communities are actually affected by a range of other multiple cascading issues that are really impacted by the activities of these emitting industries. Coastal hazards, growing inequity, rising costs of living. These are the things that the coastal communities in Australia are really facing at the moment. I want to also ask this question about who is vulnerable, and one of the issues in Australia as well is that coastal communities are often seen as idyllic, and it's actually seen as a privilege to live in coastal regions in Australia. So they're not necessarily considered to be where the most vulnerable people are. But what we've found in our studies are that there are dramatically increasing levels of support service requirements in relation to food, clothing, shelter, and also mental health and drug abuse in these communities. And this has been particularly apparent since the advent of COVID-19, but not because of COVID-19. It's because of the institutional responses to COVID-19 and the growing inequities within the communities that make them even more vulnerable to coastal hazards. But it's often hidden. And I think this is a very important point when we're talking about just transitions, because we can't assume that we know where vulnerability exists. So a lot of the case studies that we were looking at around Australia, if you look at the front of the houses of some of these people, the lawns are mown, the front of the house looks great. But Or as soon as you go through the front door, the fridge is empty. There's no furniture. So it's this shame of being vulnerable that is potentially leading to a potential perception that there is no vulnerability. And one of the quotes from our key informants was, "It may not be on your street, but chances are it is on your street." So it's this idea that vulnerability is explicit, it's apparent, but it's often very hidden. And I think that's something that makes it a challenge to look at how we actually respond in a just way, how we transition in a just way. Now, I wanted to move on because we're talking about pathways, and in a lot of places around the world, I think tourism is often identified as this panacea to problems in the coastal zone as a potential transition pathway that may be more just. But we looked at the most highly cited papers published in the tourism discipline and found that there was a divide. So negative sentiment was present in 84% of these highly cited papers. None of the papers discussing environmental conditions expressed any positive sentiment, and 76% of the papers that did discuss economic contributions expressed positive sentiment, but largely failed to acknowledge the broader adverse economic impact. So they're only really looking at the economic impact of one particular tourism initiative on one particular place or one particular community. And I think this is very problematic. And I think it also parallels with the way that we're actually examining just adaptations and transitions, because we remain focused on micro-scale impacts, which cumulatively represent very significant social ecological challenges. We aren't interrogating the underpinning macro drivers that it will be required to change to enable sustained just transitions. So this is a diagram from a paper that we published recently on this idea of tourism, the impacts of coastal tourism, where you can see here a lot of people are just very focused on the micro impacts, and in fact don't actually acknowledge the tsunami of change from urbanization, global finance, as well as climate change that is totally reshaping these communities. And so in a lot of these studies, we're actually taking a rear view image of what's happened. And I think we're doing this with a lot of the just transition approaches as well. So I think it's very critical to understand that we need to move away from a focus on micro scale to looking at the macro drivers of change. So just in summary, what does this mean for just transitions? Well, first of all, I think it's incredibly important that we take a systems view to this. And a lot of us have been talking about systems views for a long time, but I think we tend to go back into our small areas that we're comfortable researching, and we tend to still find that it's still looking at parts of the problem, not how they fit together. There's problems, as I said, in assuming who, what, and where vulnerabilities exist, and also why and how they exist. And as I said, it's this focus on we really need to shift our focus towards the macro drivers of change, not just climatic, but economic and social as well. And of course, we can't forget the more than human in our discussions around just transitions. So hopefully that's provided a bit of stimulus, food for thought. If you want some more information, happy to email me directly or to go to our project website. If you just Google coastal governance, you should get the link. So thanks very much. I'll hand over back to you, Leslie and Liana. Stop sharing.
Fabulous. Thank you very much indeed, Tim, and thank you as well. Greatly appreciate you keeping to time. I can't see any sort of short technical clarification questions in the chat. So as I say, what I propose is that we just keep working through the contributions, and then we have some time for discussion at the end. So I'd now like to pass the baton over to Professor Dennis Aheto, who is also a Future Earth Coasts Academy member and is also the lead of the IPO in Ghana. So Dennis, over to you.
Yeah, so thank you very much and good morning from Ghana. I'm specifically speaking from Kumasi, which is far from my home base in Cape Coast. I want to crave your indulgence so that I can share my slides, if you don't mind. I'm trying to get that done. Yeah, so do you see it, please?
Yes, we do.
Yep.
Right. So first of all, I wish to thank you all for this opportunity. And I'm grateful that Tim has already set the tone with the discussion on this topic. I'm very happy that at least I have the opportunity from this side of the world, in Africa, specifically from Ghana, to share some insights into how we perceive this issue of just transition. Obviously, my presentation is trying to look at entry points into which we can actually take full benefits of the situation. Unfortunately, I'm having a problem with moving my slides. Maybe, Zia, I sent it to you. Can you project from your side, if you don't mind? I think my laptop is just frozen. Please, do you hear me? Hello?
I also have your slides. I can share.
So I think it's working now. Sorry, it's working
Yes.
now.
Okay.
Now, that's what I was saying, that probably you could have shared from your side. Yeah, so in my outline, I will be talking about the just transition and the nexus of sustainability, the way I perceive it, and the West African case study, and then the ACE-Core approach, which is the Africa Center of Excellence in Coastal Resilience framework that we are working on to be able to achieve this kind of opportunity, and then some issues that I want to touch on in respect of the conclusion. So just to touch briefly on the nexus of sustainability. Basically, as has been underscored by Tim, we're looking at kind of taking advantage or how we can optimize the benefits that accrue from the environment, the social context, as well as the economic benefits that we derive from investments within the coast. But before I do that, let me provide you some perspective into what we perceive as what is happening in Africa, particularly in the western part of Africa. West Africa's coastal zone is highly productive. Bear in mind that we are talking about across the continent, about 38 coastal countries. Many of these places are very productive, biodiversity rich, and critical for the region's economy. Yet, unfortunately, are undergoing severe environmental degradation, mainly from coastal erosion, flooding, pollution, most of which are also as a result of industrialization, which has been touched on already. Erosion of African coasts are triggered mainly by poorly managed coastal infrastructure, altering coastal sediment transport, such as deep water ports with limited planning and consideration of its impact. We've also seen large transversal river barriers like hydropower dams, built on large river systems that also play an important role as they alter fluvial sediments, transport, and lead to coastal imbalances. We've also seen cross-border mismanagement of coastal sediment, where sediment budgets are not properly accounted for, and we've seen quite a number of issues in relation to that. And so in positioning how we see a desired future in terms of how we take advantage of the just transition concept, we see it more as a situation whereby it basically overlaps with the Sustainable Development Goals. If we are able to appropriately optimize the benefits that we are getting from the environmental ecosystem services, you know, in terms of how we extract goods and services from our ecosystem, coastal and marine ecosystems, for the benefit of society, improving their standards of living, providing equal opportunity for men and women, including fishers and fishmongers, providing profits and income savings that promotes economic growth. All this happening on the back of very strong environmental justice situations where we are responsible for the stewardship of our coastal and marine environment, running on the back of research and development. And so I wish to share with you a case study which is taken from Ghana as an example of how we perceive how difficult it is to manage our coast. You know, so following from a period of unbundling the issues, it is clear that first, the solutions are very complex because you definitely require data data modeling to find the right solutions to resist the powerful wave energy, sea level rise, you know, ocean acidification and issues that are resulting from climate change. The second issue has to do with the fact that interventions are very costly, especially where hard solutions, for instance, installing sea defense walls, or even the case of nature-based solution, they are not cheap either. You know, these investments are very costly. Of course, public sector financing is equally scarce. Private sector finance, even if it's anything to go by, are not readily available for coastal protection, as there is no revenue generation from that investment. Although it does not certainly mean that private sector has no role to play. We also, thirdly, have observed that multiple sector ministries are usually responsible for managing the coastline. In the case of West Africa, we do not have, for instance, institutions that are largely focused on blue economy, even though they are dispersed within various government institutions, ministries of environment, ministry of fisheries, in some other cases, ministries of petroleum. And so we do find multiple involvement, multiple sector ministries or agencies, government agencies, responsible for issues of the coastal and marine environment. So you have agencies that are responsible for land management, fisheries, urban and energy and ports, all segregated. The third issue, which is also dear to my heart, working in the university, also has to do with the fact that the science of it, in providing technical solutions and the science, makes things even more complex because the capacity is not readily available. The very limited capacity and opportunities, job opportunities provided within the sector are limited, even though that is where we tend to see most of the problems coming from. You know, there are, in many cases, we even require cross-border collaboration, particularly when it has to do with issues like sargassum, upsurge, or oil and gas spills, and so on. And so it is important that in looking at just transition, we are not only looking at just the local scale, but we're also looking at the regional and international levels, you know. So, and as part of it, it's also evident that we require long-term commitment on the side of the policymakers to be able to manage these kinds of problems. So this community is a very small community in Ghana, just about 500 to 700 inhabitants, located on the sandbar. You can see that downstream, you find very intensive gold mining activities, which has literally made the water very turbid. Obviously, analysis has also shown the, how do you call it, a lot of heavy metal pollution. which invariably has also affected small-scale fisheries, entrenching the poverty levels, and so on and so forth. And so the question is, how do we build the resilience of these communities if we're talking about a desired future where we are not leaving anyone behind? Tim spoke about not leaving anyone behind. How do we promote local economies to be economically viable? The impacts of IUU fishing and other issues that are not directly related to climate change, things to do with illegal sand winning activities, which eventually exacerbates the impact of climate change. So these are issues that, in talking about just transition, which of these challenges that we are faced with on the continent, how do we approach them from an entry point that makes it quite easy to look at? And so this is still the same community, Anglo Beach, where we did some shoreline analysis. And over time, we've been able to, since 2018, our analysis has actually shown that on the average, the shoreline is actually being lost at a rate of 1.5 meter per year, which is quite alarming for such community. And so it's not surprising that the World Bank recently has approved a $150 million program to support hard engineering structures for the construction of sea defense wall across the coasts of Ghana. And one major issue that is arising also has to do with the issue of landing sites for artisanal small-scale fishers. And so these are real issues on the ground, on the continent, that we are faced with. Impact of IUU fishing and lack of job opportunities for local people. And so this is how we are coming in to support the process in order to, as a university and as a center of excellence. We have tried very hard over the past 10 years to establish a very high-level platform that's, of course, can still be scaled up to accelerate coastal resilience in Africa. And we are doing this through a three-pronged approach, where we are stimulating the generation of knowledge, we are mobilizing finance, and engaging in political dialogue. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that I'm extremely happy about to be part of this Future F Coast is that it provides this broad-based platform, not just politically, but also from academic and research point of view, where we are able to dialogue and share knowledge and draw attention to some of these issues at a very high political level. And so at our center, we focus on these three key issues to be able to provide evidence-based scientific data, working with Africans, trained by Africans. Of course, we do have support from other institutions globally in terms of our advisory board membership, sectoral advisory membership, to support whatever we do. So permit me to just quickly touch on some of the areas in terms of these three areas that I've mentioned. So what we've done is that we've been able to create this platform in Ghana from the University of Cape Coast, where we are stimulating training and capacity building. Sorry about that. Stimulating research and capacity building across the continent with the support of several institutions, development partners. Of course, the World Bank and USAID are major partners. And over the past 5 years, we have been able to produce about 85 research scientific publications, Scopus indexed, that is since 2019. We have students from Senegal through to Eritrea, as you can see from the map. We also do have scientific advisors all across the globe. At the postgraduate and master's level, and of course, promoted, facilitated development of several memorandum of understanding. And so broadly, these are some of the current partnerships we have. Talking about finance, that is an area that I spoke about. Mobilizing finance is very critical, not just from development partners, but also from the private sector. And one significant one I wish to mention is the partnership with the African Union. And we are happy that through that platform, we are also able to support activities within the small island developing states where where we find that they are mostly disadvantaged when it comes to issues of climate change and impact on fisheries and other biodiversity, aquatic biodiversity assets. And finally,
can I just come in very briefly and just I could ask you just to wrap up within a couple of minutes, please.
Right. So this is just the last slide, and just to say that we also stimulate quite a lot of discussions on global stage. We were part of the discussions at the Ocean Conference in Panama and other international platforms where we try to stimulate the voice, African voice, in terms of how these things should be like. So in terms of just transition, we also think that the African voice really is very critical in making sure that we make the world a just place. Thank you very much.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you for battling through the various technical connectivity issues that you had there. I appreciate that ate into your time a little bit, so I apologize for chasing you on. Thanks very much. And again, I don't see any technical questions in the chat.
Oh, no.
So, I'll just pass the baton over in that case to another of our FEC academicians, Liana Talue McManus, who has been working with me to pull this session together and is going to give us another perspective on just transitions. Liana, over to you.
I think I'll just have to leave. Yes.
Can you have, you have to unshare?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good day, everyone. In this brief talk, I will explore the nature and challenges of a just transition for coastal livelihoods. I got this framework from the movement generation for a just transition. The centerpiece elements are resources plus work towards a purpose, the aspiration being ecological and social well-being. Governance is guided by a worldview, then mediates the access and use of resources. This framework is applicable to coastal livelihoods as well. However, there are unique things about coastal livelihoods. Yes, we are subject to pressures such as that from globalized trade and global warming, but at watershed scale, the coastal zone is unique in that it accumulates pressures from a land to sea or downstream direction. As such, human activities that cause land use change or the flow of pollutants and extraction of resources along this continuum impacts the state of coastal livelihoods. A second unique element is that there is a multiplicity of property regimes that define access and use of resources, from those that are based on exclusive use rights, such as granting concessions, or a common property regime, say reserving an area for subsistence use, all the way to open access. I will use the work I have done in Bolinao, northern Philippines, to exemplify these features. Bolinao is in northern Luzon and is a coastal municipality of Lingayen Gulf, which in turn interacts with the South China Sea. In 1993, we launched a community-based coastal resources management project in the municipality of Bolinao, the first for the Philippines, in response to public fora, particularly in Bolinao, where declining fish catches, and inequity of access was articulated. In a prior year in 1991, the Philippine Local Government Code was enacted. This is key because it devolved the management of municipal waters and resources therein, that is 15 kilometers out from shore, to local government units. Within a year after we launched the project, the national government proposed to industrialize the Northwestern Luzon Growth Quadrangle, and the first proposal was to build a cement plant in Bolinao. With the hard work of the citizenry, this proposal was disapproved with finality in 1996. Let me share the framework that we used in this particular project. We addressed three foundational elements, and these are community mobilization to build local coastal resource management institutions, fortified by environmental education that builds on traditional local knowledge. These foundational elements would allow the community to embark on resource management, networking and advocacy, and of course, livelihood development. The enactment of the Philippine Local Government Code meant that the project must be participatory and empowering to the local stakeholders of Bolinao. But who are the stakeholders? We did a mapping of the stakeholders along three axes, one of power, profit, and resource dependence, and the arrows indicate increasing variable. The subsistence fishers and gatherers are at the intersection of the three axes, with the political and economic elite at the top. We quickly learned that the stakeholders extended beyond the resident population to include foreign and domestic investors living outside of Bolinao. To facilitate participatory development planning, we spent the first 2 years mobilizing the community to form people's organizations in key villages of the municipality. These local CRM, coastal resource management organizations, became venues for developing a common stewardship vision, vetting actions, and exchanging technical inputs from the project and local ecological knowledge of resource users. The following 2 years was spent for participatory planning. Local organizations with representation from the local government worked on designing the development plan, with the project serving as secretariat. It was legislated as a municipal ordinance in 2000, the first for the Philippines. The plan identified 4 traditional use zones: Zone 1 for ecotourism, Zone 2 for multiple use, including aquaculture, Zone 3 for fishery management of reef flat and reef slope fisheries, and a 4th one for trade and navigation. It is important to note that there were overarching principles declared under the Declaration of Policy, which states that subsistence users would have preferential use of resources, and that it will grant privilege to the private sector to use fishery resources only in the context of its participation in conservation and management. Let's hone in on aquaculture. Bolinao is one of the best sources of milkfish fry, but access has been highly inequitable. A concession is granted to the highest bidder or powerful political ally, usually, and small-scale fry gatherers have to sell to the concessionaire, often below market price. The resource users proposed for a permitting system to supplant the concessionaire system. Following a study, but the municipal government said that it did not have the management infrastructure to deal with multiple permit holders. To this day, the concession system unfortunately remains. The milkfish fry are grown in fish pens and fish cages in Zone 2 in the channel. We constructed an oceanographic model of the water circulation to determine the carrying capacity of the channel. It identified that about 550 pens and cages of a particular size can be established in areas with non-restricted water flow to maintain a healthy estuary. However, 2 years after the development plan was passed, there was proliferation of fish pens and cages in areas with restricted water flow. Without saying much, the fish pens exceeded the carrying capacity not in number, but because of location. A dinoflagellate bloom happened coincident with El Nino event, and it led to a massive fish kill amounting to $10 million in 2002. Subsequent occurrences of harmful algal blooms and El Nino events happened, but with much less loss because adaptive management measures were taken. One of them was a multi-sectoral monitoring system, as well as an emergency response system so that fish farmers are flagged when the blooms are already beginning. However, the critical point of relocating fish pens and fish cages were not done to allow for water flow to become unrestricted. So even with the legislated coastal development plan, regulation of wild fish fry access and milkfish aquaculture was extremely weak and did not necessarily benefit subsistence and local fishers as their estuarine grounds actually deteriorated. So the key challenges are that the concept of carrying capacity and natural limits are hard concepts to accept. The principle of subsidiarity is codified in the local government code. It is a requisite, but insufficient because critical gaps remain, including resilience and ecological social well-being being a shared vision from local to national. The equitable access and ownership regimes and sustainable scales are designed but must be codified and practiced. The long-term resilience has to be ecosystem resilience has to be placed above short-term profit to guide plans and actions. And for us knowledge brokers, science as a service to local communities must remain accessible beyond project lifespans. And with that, I end on a low note, but hopefully these are challenges that can guide actions. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much indeed, Liana. Thank you as well also for keeping to time and for giving us such a wonderful and very empirical insight from a very different kind of resource-dependent community facing complex challenges. Now, just for our last short contribution this morning, I would like to invite another FEC Academy member. I'm going to try and pronounce this as best I can. So Professor Luis Druade de la Cerda, I hope I've pronounced that as best I can. Pass the floor over to you to talk to us a little bit about rehabilitation of environments.
Yep. Let me share everything with you. I'm still trying to, maybe I'll leave it for my Chinese organization to pass my slides. I'm a little bit sleepy still. So if you can share the slides for me, I would appreciate. It was interesting to listen to some talks from our colleagues from Ghana and from Liana, because most of what I'm going to talk is about that. I mean, in Ghana, you're trying to make the community sustainable, but upriver you have gold mining. So probably all your fish resources are contaminated. Liana talked about the aquaculture section, which is a disaster all over the world, because the example was very, very interesting, because we have the same thing here in Brazil regarding shrimp culture. Probably Mario knows a lot about that. That you can legislate and try to control the situation and establish a given number of area, or whatever, for shrimp aquaculture or mariculture. And then eventually it doesn't work. It doesn't work because you normally establish this as a very fixed number, and the environment is not fixed, and environmental variables are changing. And the major talk I'm going to talk about is exactly that. Any kind of just transition are absolutely threatened by the state of the world. Mostly, I'm going to use the example of mercury because I've worked with mercury, but also because it's a very toxic element. It's the only element in the whole periodic table that causes human deaths through environmental exposure. Is a global pollutant, so it's everywhere. If you analyze our Ghana fisheries or Liana's fry fish, there'll be a lot of mercury there. And it may turn very difficult, this just transition, mostly to the local traditional population. This is a very sad thing of our world today. Most of what you talk about, well, they will work for the wealthy, but not for the others. I mean, if you think about the breakers that are proposed to be done in the Ghana coast, who is going to benefit from that? Hardly the fisheries, the local fisheries. And many other, like the aquaculture, mariculture sector, you know, who really profit from that? Not the local people, obviously. And this problem of the state of the world in terms of contamination, mostly, and also the lack of resilience of natural ecosystems, which goes to the supporting capacity that Liana talked very well about, may hamper most of the attempts to make a fair, just transition, at least for the local communities. The next one, please. So just a quick summary of what I call the legacy of our irresponsibility for the last 200 years. Although it's probably 200,000 years, but I cannot take responsibility for the Romans mining silver or the Phoenicians destroying all the trees from the Mediterranean coast to build a fleet. But at least 200 years ago, we already know the problems of delivering such amounts of substances. And there are many examples. You can see mercury increasing emissions to the atmosphere during the World War, industrialization. This on the left is a huge production and emission of metals like copper, zinc, lead, and the effects of that. Mostly you can see down there, you probably know about Northeastern Brazil. Northeastern Brazil is a kind of Caribbean Brazilian. I mean, it's only tourism, it's beautiful, clean waters, the mecca of windsurfing and things like that. But if you look at the graph below, nearly all those substances have their sources from anthropogenic origin, which are larger, much larger than the natural sources. So in any ecological point of view, you can say that all ecosystems in this whole stretch of the Brazilian coast is out of their baseline. I'm not saying that they are destroyed or polluted or anything, but they are out of their baseline. And another problem which makes more difficult things is the graph down in the left side, which is this shift from point sources of pollutants to diffuse sources, something that in Ghana probably their community is facing. How to manage those sources, how to control these sources. And you've probably been aware of the recent large press cover of the Amazonian gold mining, which is exactly the same thing, how to cope with 300,000 small miners, artisanal. It's nearly impossible. The next one, please. And one of the results of this legacy is the state of what Diana called the supporting capacity of our ecosystem. I mean, this is a model that we have developed with our late colleague, Win Salamos, that died last year and has collaborated a lot in LOICs and FECs, and well, huge contribution. And this is basically a theoretical framework to explain what we're dealing with. Now, in this red line over there is probably where we are, from the Antarctic to the Arctic, because as I showed for the northeastern coast of Brazil, anywhere in the world is probably already out of their baselines. So we may be somewhere in this curve. And what does mean? Does mean that in the beginning, a small on the left increasing in input of a contaminant, which is the key one here, will cause very small mobilization. And mobilization means toxicity, exposure, and everything. But if you go up on this line, the same amount, the same small amount, P2, will provoke enormous mobilization of pollutants. So this is just a graphic way of saying that our ecosystems are losing their capacity and other small curves that will probably, since it's not converted, it will start out of an equilibrium and reach another one, and then the conversion from aquaculture that will be ecosystems absolutely without the capacity of holding anything, as you can see probably in the next slide, please. This is a very common situation in any area, probably in where Liana worked, it happens a lot, which is basically eutrophication from different sources of nutrients and carbon, urbanization, agriculture, aquaculture, while the different time of response is basically due to the quality of the carbon from terrestrial origin, from marine origin, degradability, and things like that. I'm not going to talk about that. But the other graph is very important. On your left side, it's a mangrove area submitted to 2,000 hectares of shrimp ponds. And on the right, another mangrove, exactly the same. There are very similar places here in Northeast Brazil that receive effluent from only 9 hectares of ponds. Don't talk about the amount. Obviously, the amounts are huge. But if you talk about the capacity of this system to hold, in this case, phosphorus, but it was for nitrogen, for mercury, for lead, for anything. I mean, this impacted system, which is in our later curve, is probably much higher than this one, can hold only, well, 54% of the total amount of phosphorus entering the system, while normally a pristine mangrove area would hold about 96%. So this is the kind of difference that can make a huge impact on any management if you don't take it into consideration. The next one, please. And above that, we are facing a huge pressure from global climate change. For instance, Liana presented a very nice LOICs view of the coastline with the impacts coming from high in the catchment. But nowadays, you have a very huge impact also coming from the ocean. I work in the South Atlantic. The South Atlantic is the ocean that accumulated more heat than any other ocean in the planet. Therefore, this forcing is so huge that in the area where I live, which is already a semi-arid climate, this is like a huge wall of oceanic water pressing coastal waters and estuarine waters inside the continent. Well, as a consequence, mangroves are going up and up and up along the rivers. But this is a huge impact also that is normally we tend to work on averages, the global average, but the world does not respond the same way to the global climate change pressure. So this is an example how already extreme environment, which is where I work, a semi-arid coastline, similar to Senegal, parts of Australia, parts of the Mediterranean coast, the Pacific coast of the North America, Caribbean areas, which already has lots of problems related to low water availability in the continent. And when you look on those graphs, you see, well, you know, this area where I work here, the Sierra State, is losing an average of 5.6 millimeters per year of rainfall. Well, what is that? You cannot even fill a glass of water with that. But this is already 40% in the last 30-year reduction of our total annual rainfall, which is less than 400 millimeters a year. So losing even 4 millimeters is 1% a year, meaning that half a century we're losing half of the water. Yeah, and this is worse when you go to the dry season. Another important effect, and I'll try to put everything together in 10 minutes, it will not be that easy, but I'll try, is down here in this graph, close to the forcing. You see, that is the teleconnection from the Indian Ocean going to the northeast Brazil. And this is what I call the huge heat of the South Atlantic impact on our coastline. But on the right, you can see the frequency of extreme drought, meaning a drought that lasts for more than 3 years. And this is a register since the 16th, and it passed from 1 to 2 extended drought per half century to about 14 per half century, meaning that this half century, since 2000, we had 17 years of rainfall below the average historical mean. And this is a typical climate change impact. The next one, please. And how it impacts on that pollution, the legacy of pollution. Obviously, I mean, you probably, from Leslie from Scotland, is probably measuring some lead and copper from the Nord Stream explosion. Yeah, that remobilized lots of pollutants from the North Sea sediments recently. But this is accidental. I mean, some guy has to explode something. But what I'm showing you is not accidental. It's what is happening about the last 50, maybe a century. I don't know. There's no measure to a century. But all these forces, they result in invasion of the seawater to the coastline. In terms of biogeochemistry, the most important aspect is choking. There's this Bjorn Curves term, which is loved. It choked continental waters in estuaries. In our case, full of mangroves. So you increase the biogeochemical health of mangroves, which is a reactor for trace metals. It complex trace metals with organic complex, because organic matter decomposition is not 100%. It's sulfate production metabolism. So you produce a lot of dissolved organic complex. That complex mobilize and make metals bioavailable. Well, this is a model for this. I'm not going to explain that. I can send the papers. But what is the result on the local communities? This is a very important thing. The next one, please.
Coming very
As a
briefly,
result, this
just to wrap up in
situation.
just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, this is the last one.
Thank you.
Or nearly the last one. This just results in an increasing bioavailability of mercury in this area. Who explore this area is the local fishermen. So you can see an increasing mercury contamination down in the estuary, where the local community fish. And then when you look there, and this, well, the other graph is just a bioaccumulation is 10 times higher in this marine section of the estuary. And on your right, down edge, is the exposure to mercury of the local population. So you see the population that lives in the marine sector, which is far from any source of mercury, has an exposure which is 3 times higher than the fluvial communities. The last one, please. Oh, I think, yeah. One specific impact of that, when you calculate the legal limits, based on the Bauer's usual scenario, you have this first red line over there. But when you calculate the actual limit, based on the local conditions, it drops to 20%. So even our legal framework is not enough to protect this community. The next one, and I think is just to say to you, that this thing is not only from the northeastern Brazil. Yeah, this situation is occurring all over the world and is more intense in more extreme events. And we are not prepared to face this situation. I think it was Chin that talked about most of our management legislation is anthropocenic. Even our concept of sustainability has to be reviewed. It's mostly based on a capital-driven society. So their goals are capital-driven also. And so under this situation of low supporting capacity of most ecosystems, the legacy of contamination we have, maybe we won't be able to cope with situation in the future. Yeah, so that is my presentation. Please, the last one, which just is thank to my Chinese colleague that
However, first, I do see in the chat that Ayeta Grace had a question. Ayeta Grace, if you're there, if you'd like to come on and share your question yourself, then please do so. Otherwise, I'll read it out, and then Mario and I will come to you after. Well, it seems to be a bit quiet, so I'll just, hello? There should be an echo from my side, so I'll just read the question out in that case. And the question is, I would like to know a bit more about what
Good morning.
what Tim means by... Good morning, thank you. Yes, please do ask your question.
Okay, so I wanted Professor Tim to shed some light on the more than human concept. While he was presenting, he made mention of a more than human concept or so. I wanted him to shed some light on that.
Thanks very much, DeGracia. I think this is a concept that has really come out of, I mean, it's a few different fields, but I know most of the work from the geography field, human geographers, cultural geographers, and it's really, I think, being very explicit about the term more than human rather than other or non-human. And it's really about recognizing a few dimensions. And first of all, you know, because of the Anthropocene, you know, it's really that people have an ethical responsibility to look at justice that goes beyond people. And secondly, also recognizing that we are in fact so dependent on so many species. And I think that so it's really trying to recognize this through an ethical perspective on species that aren't human. And so the term more than human has really been a concept that has been embraced. I guess it's not only by geographers, it's also by people looking at urban studies, ecofeminists, even in the science and technology studies, this term more than human is becoming more and more dominant. It's been around for quite a while, and it builds around a lot of other works. Even Bruno Latour, for instance, has been talking about similar concepts in the past. So, you know, that it builds on a momentum, and I think it's really saying that really we have a responsibility because of the Anthropocene to really be looking at recognizing that we are dependent on other species, and we have an ethical responsibility, and we need to look at multi-species justice, and that the more than human term is a fitting term rather than saying that it's other species separate to us. So that's really a bit of background. If you want to know more, perhaps have a look. There's quite a few resources in the literature, in cultural studies, human geography studies, for instance, around the term more than human. Thanks.
Oh, I think it is clear. Thank you very much, Prof. Yeah.
Thank you.
Super. Thank you. Thank you very much. Marion, I think your hand was up before, so I'll
That's right.
pass over to you.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much to all speakers. I want to sort of link between something Dennis Aheto said and something that Drude said. And that is, of course, relating to mercury pollution. Dennis, I was really impressed by knowledge, dialogue, capacity building, all these activities and platforms that you have built. When you were speaking, I actually was thinking of heavy metal pollution and didn't quite see it on there. So my question is, what kind of role does it play in all the activities? Because you did mention it, it wasn't on the slide, heavy metals pollution. And I just wondered what actual ways out or capacity building you are implementing on that count with those that case study community that you mentioned that is directly exposed. And then Drude, thanks very much for this really, really sobering account of our legacy. And I just wanted to ask communities and regional governments that face this, what kind of practical solutions are there available? Are there just none? Or are there practical things that can be done? Is there technology, any filtering? What can, in this situation, well-meaning regional governments or other decision makers do? So that would be my
questions. So if I may respond. Yeah, I also see one of our just recently graduated PhD student, Charles, from Nigeria, who did quite a lot on pollution. Maybe after my intervention, time permitting, he can talk briefly about his work. But by and large, the problem in Ghana, as has been mentioned by Drude, is the issue of inland surface gold mining, which has seriously impacted on our river bodies, eventually entering into our marine environment through the estuaries. And so we are faced with a very serious problems of heavy metal contamination. And there has been researches that have been done in terms of contamination in fish, water, and even the sediments. And the results aren't so good. And in some cases, we have even recorded close to some carcinogenic levels, which is certainly one of the biggest problems. So mercury, lead, cadmium are major heavy metal impacts. Charles, would you be able to share a few perspectives on some of your work on fingerprinting, heavy metal fingerprinting in the estuary?
Yeah. Yes, thank you so much, Prof. Good morning to everyone. So in my own PhD.
Can't hear. There's no, can't hear.
Hello.
Well, I think he's having an issue, but we would share, as I indicated, there are quite a lot of researches that have been done. We will share with you those publications on the heavy metal pollution so that you can have the details of the specific. But it's certainly a life-threatening situation because of the issue of bioaccumulation in fish when it comes to...
That's in terms of equity, where I was asking what is actually being done right now to the children whose brain development is endangered. It's happening right now. What can communities and governments do right now? That was my...
and that is really why we need a very strong civil society and, of course, political actors who are really very serious. And one of the things that I highlighted was the fact that data is limiting to be able to really justify the big challenge that we are faced with, and something that we are actively contributing to in terms of the research. And we're moving forward on the data policy transition so that given the platforms we have, such as this and others that we have in country, we are actively promoting these issues through webinars, through conferences. As a matter of fact, later this year, we are organizing a conference, the Blue Economy Conference, which is a regional conference, where we are going to push some of these issues. Eventually, it will lead to some policy actions, strong ones, hopefully. Yeah. Time did not really permit to show some of the scientific results from some of the work done. Yeah, I see Charles has shared some of his public, but a lot more others that we'll be putting across for your information.
That's good. And well, I know from personal experience that this question was an issue in Brazil 25 years ago. So I wonder whether data policy transition has moved ahead there.
Well, Mario,
yes. Yes, well, it hasn't really moved. I mean, not at all, because one of
no, I mean, the West Africa might be a different case. I'm not sure about how research has progressed in different continents, but my hope would be that it might show something of a way forward in Brazil.
Well, I can be very optimistic and answer one way, but I think we are, I mean, reaching an age that you have to be very realistic. No, to your answer. 25 years of environmental legislation was destroyed in 5 years of the last office. So you have to rebuild everything. Regarding your questions before, although the legal framework is available, so we hope it will be easier to control the situation now. It won't take 25 years. Yeah. Because the legal is there. So you have just someone wanting to enforce the legislation, which is pretty good, by the way. Regarding your question, unfortunately, we already passed the time of mitigating the situation. We have to adapt in terms of this legacy of contamination. So one thing is try to improve the supporting capacity of the natural ecosystem. And in case of nowadays, it's a very interesting thing because all this blue carbon economy that people talk about, and there is a huge market for carbon, all those fancy capital-driven things came to help a lot because replanting mangroves, which is something all over the world is happening, mostly after the tsunami in Asia in 2004, when people, it was very easy to see how the mangrove protect the area behind it. And then after that, there's mitigating carbon by increasing carbon sink capacity of natural ecosystem. And this triggered huge replanting of mangroves all over the world. There was a very interesting paper some months ago of an optimistic view that mangrove are increasing all over the world. It's not that true, but nearly like that. You worked in northeastern Brazil, where the mangroves are pretty well preserved because of nature, because it's so difficult to cut things there because people doesn't grow there so easily. But there's a necessity of replanting mangroves for the carbon market ends up being a very good strategy to immobilize trace metals. And this worked pretty well. We have done that in large areas in the South Brazil, where industrial contamination is much higher. And it was very successful in immobilizing it. But this is a very important thing. We are not solving the problem. Yeah. We're just immobilizing the problem. It won't cause contamination, but it's there. I mean, again, coaching with Solomons, I mean, it's something that is out of your sight, but you have to keep it in your mind because it's there. So if this replanting areas in southeastern Brazil will be eventually open for shrimp aquaculture or navigation canal, this will mobilize tons of trace matter. So this is something that is very important. And this is what worries me about aquaculture. Yeah, aquaculture has a huge potential for remobilizing pollutants. It's very critical. On the other side, there is a way of mitigating and adapting to this situation but you need a lot of studies on sociology, economics, things like that. There is a very well-known example in Canada. Canada is an area where you have a lot of lakes. Some of those, the last picture that I show of a small sign in a lake, well, you can fish, but you cannot eat because it's full of mercury. Canada has lots of places like this. And one thing they did, they said, wow, but you have traditional population that depends on the fisheries. So why not give them another food support so they don't need to fish? And then you have to take a lot of care. In this case, there is a huge increase of cardio disease because they start putting too much animal protein in their diet and not fish. This is something that is happening in the Amazon. I mean, if you go inland where people are changing their habits and eating more meat, which was virtually not available for the traditional population in the Amazon, and then, you know, heart disease increases. So you have to take care. It's possible, yes. Obviously, in the case of mercury, fishing down on the, like our fisheries colleague Pauli talked a lot about. I mean, fishing down the food web is also a solution, not only in terms of the carbon cycle, but also avoiding mercury contamination. But sometimes it's not possible. I mean, it's very difficult to regulate. I mean, our colleague from Ghana probably knows that. It's very difficult to regulate in these traditional groups what they're going to eat. I mean, change their habits, change their diet. It's something that first has to be taken care because of these changes in metabolic way of working the food. And second, I mean, it's a cultural thing. I mean, it cannot change culture as it was, you know, changing my jeans legs or something like that. It's something that needs a lot of more studies. But then again, there's something that Tim raised, which is not only for ecological management, but everything in our society is centered on humans from, and not all humans. It's a typical kind of human, a human capital-driven in a very wealthy society, and on and on and on. I mean, if you have time to, I did that, and I was appalled by that, by reading Brundtland report from 1997 too, which is our Bible for the environment. And when you read it and put in nowadays terms, you say, my goodness, it won't work. Or it will work, but it will just consider half of the world's population, in fact, a little bit more than half of the world's population. Because we think we can change by technology, by markets, by anything, design a concept of sustainability, which is based on economic sustainability. And, you know, you have to think a little bit more on how people really want to live. You know, something that we're discussing in Brazil a lot because of the Amazon problem with the Yanomami. I mean, we have the Canadians do that with their nations. I mean, everywhere in the world, people start seeing that maybe something has to be redefined epistemologically. It's not only a kind of you know, design or anything like that. It is the epistemology of those concepts has to be reviewed. I wrote a paper on sustainability. What is that? It's mangrove sustainability that was published in Sustainability. And in the end, our conclusion is that it won't work if we keep on thinking and using the sustainability concept as it is. Because Marion worked a lot on the communities in North Brazil. If instead of their objectives, you start putting our objectives of welfare, of having more money, of having more facilities, more materials, it won't work because the system won't sustain that. This is very good for, you know, agriculture, heavy agriculture industry, but normally natural ecosystems are so well organized that they don't profit. I mean, profit is a word that nature doesn't know. I mean, if there is profit, it means that the ecosystem is out of the supporting capacity, and then it's, you know, lianas, red tides, and alga blooms, and eutrophisation. What is that? That is the profit of nature in the end. Yeah, it's the surplus. The surplus is contamination, pollution, eutrophisation, algal blooms, and whatever. So I think it goes all back to Tim's presentation that we have to discuss the concepts. But yes, back to your, yes, there is a solution to adapt, to mitigate, but we need a lot more studies and a different view when you deal with local population. You see, I have the example, sorry, Dennis, but when you talk about ocean breakers, in Ceará, we do this nearly every month. And we just export the problem, in this case, westward, because our coastal drift is east to west. So we're just exporting erosion to the next municipality, and then it's their problem, not ours. And then it deals with breakwater and exports it to the next one, and on and on and on. So maybe those solutions cannot be applied any longer. I mean, you need to discuss a little bit more about that. Unfortunately, the World Bank doesn't think like that. So he has the money. So.
Thanks very much for the very comprehensive response. I'm aware we're already over time. I do see, though, that there is one question in the chat. Rael has asked a question here, which is a very wide-ranging question, and I think it would be good. I'm going to kind of take privilege or whatever as chair, and I'm going to direct this question towards Liana, who we've not heard from in the discussion yet. Do we integrate all the different aspects of just transitions at global, regional, and local level to make change? Looking at the presentations from different regions, it's clear that we're tackling different issues. There are significant differences. That's a huge question, and I'd like to pass over to Liana just to give us a couple of thoughts on what that might look like before we wrap up.
Well, I'd probably take off from the circles, the concentric circles that Tim presented, because I think the concept that there are planetary boundaries, natural limits, is a very real thing. Yet neoclassical economics have defied that in the name of efficiency. We evolved not because of efficiency, we evolved because of redundancies. But those redundancies are eroded because we do things in the name of economic efficiency. Now, if you are to supplant the concept of efficiency, you're basically saying, let's change the economic order of the world. And that is the root of the problem. Nutrients coming out of environmental compartments is causing nutrient pollution. Heavy metals that are unbound, because they're not supposed to be there, is causing this pollution. So all of the excesses are there because we have refused to acknowledge that there are limits. So if you want to go to the root cause of the problem, the question is, if that is the root cause, what solutions do we have to address excess consumption? And, do we go back to, it says food security should be local. Food production systems should be local. So what does that mean in terms of an export economy, right? So there's a whole slew of things that needs to be done if we are to address the root cause from that perspective. The other thing is, if we allow excesses because it's hard to change the order, then we have to accept that we have passed planetary boundaries for nutrients, for gases, greenhouse gases, then we accept our fate. So it is a sobering thought. How many IPCC, how many COP conferences has passed? 15. But we're nowhere near addressing that 2 degrees Celsius boundary. We're in fact projected to surpass that within the decade. So it's if we were to integrate all this, there are actions at the individual consumption level, but there are national goals for development that have to be oriented, I would say, to this sobering fact that we need to prevent excess. We have already excess enough for 2,000 years of climate change. That's what I get as a message from climate scientists. So even if you reduce, there's already excess that will cause the tipping point. So this is this is a very difficult thing. You know, it's not integration, but addressing the root cause. But it means changing the way we've lived, perhaps in the last, oh, not too long ago, since the Industrial Revolution. So, Tim and Leslie, comments?
I think everyone agrees with you, Leanna. It's exactly right. I think the fundamental thing is that we're so fixated in the dialogue about focusing on the how, instead of going back and saying why. And it's only through asking the why question that we get to the root of the cause, like you're saying. And so I think, you know, that we just need to shift the dialogue, but I agree with you totally. There's not much more to say. I think you've said it all.
Yes.
Great. I think at that point then, I think we can just wrap up. And I just wanted to very quickly share 4 overarching insights that I took out of the conversation and the various things that are going on. The first thing is about, you know, how do we define terms and concepts around just transitions, and how do we actually make these meaningful to people at different levels, particularly communities, particularly those in more vulnerable places and regions. So that was the first thing. The second thing was around the question of whose knowledge and whose evidence counts when we're talking about just transitions, and particularly from Dennis's contribution, we saw this, but how do we bring in the science and the evidence from parts of the world that we don't hear about? Thirdly was the question of who's responsible for redressing environmental harms, and particularly how do we create an evidence-based evidence and understand this, again, especially in coastal environments where currents, sediments and all the rest adds more complexity. And lastly, and I think this maybe goes back to some of the things Tim was touching on at the start, you know, I'm a big fan of just transitions as an area of study. However, I do have a lot of concern that just transitions is becoming a concept that can be used as a discourse of delay by big polluters, by governments, and that it can be used as a discourse of delay for action on climate and environment. So going back to that question of the why, how do we keep some of the really important and relevant things from that concept, but without allowing it to be misappropriated and used for delay or division? So I'll simply stop there. Again, I'd like to reiterate my thanks to Liana for her support and mentorship for the session, and to Xiaoyu and Wei and the team at Future Earth Coasts, and to our academicians that we had presenting today. So thank you very much for all of you, and I look forward to working with you going forward.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
Great, so I think we can conclude there. Shall we? I don't know if you want to say anything as a kind of concluding remark or next steps, but otherwise I think we can finish there. Thank you.
Very thought-provoking session, and looking forward to more of it. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining this session. And we're actually planning to develop this session into a webinar series. So I can see everyone, I mean, today we didn't have really enough time to discuss and really to extend our topics and to answer all the questions. So please stay tuned. And Leslie and Liana, I really appreciate all your contributions and dedications, and all the speakers. Thank you so much. And all the audience, we look forward to seeing you in next month. Okay.